This is Ian Williams of the Foreign Press Association in New York, and I'm pleased to welcome back my old, I think I could say friend, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who is now retired as Secretary General, but maintains an active international interest across the world. And in his spare time, if he has any, he actually produced this book, Resolved: Uniting Nations in a Divided World. I think we can all agree that the world is divided. I'm not quite sure how united and uniting they are at the moment. And well, I think you should introduce the book first to tell us what your impression is of its theme and what your big message to the world is.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Ian Smith, President of a Foreign Press Association. It's a great pleasure to see you again in good health. And thank you very much, distinguished members of the FPA, to participate in this very meaningful for me occasion. I appreciate your interest in my memoir, Resolved: Uniting the Nations in a Divided World. I think the title-wise, it is very pertinent at this time. I hope this book, my memoir, will inspire possibility and spark action and improve cooperation and ultimately encourage the people around the world to become global citizens. During my 5 decades of public service, both in the Republic of Korea and at the United Nations, particularly 10 years, I have not had any time to write a book. This is the first ever in my public life, 50 years, to write something. Then, as you may know, my own life spans coincides with colonialism, wars, dictatorship, and the struggle for democracy in Korea and around the world. I myself have gone through those turbulent periods as a Korean citizen, and as well as leader of the United Nations. I was raised during the Korean War of 1950s, came of age amid terrible poverty and difficulties, and watched my country grow from dictatorship to stable and prosperous democracy with the help of the United Nations. I was a child of war, and at the same time, I was child of the United Nations. Without the United Nations, Korea would not be as she is today. These experiences grounded me in the importance of peace, opportunity, and international cooperation, beliefs that shaped my life and my tenure as a Secretary General. My commitment continues to this day. As you introduced me, I run on chair nearly a dozen organizations, global organizations devoted to sustainable development, to climate crisis, and advocacy for women and girls. I often wonder if we have forgotten lessons we had learned. One needs only to look at the global temperatures rising, alliances fracturing, and refugees fleeing to understand our precarious condition. Why are we not doing better and more to help world's people? To me, the fault most often lies with the leaders, political leaders of each and every country. Too many autocrats and dictators put themselves before their countries and their people. These rulers are selfish and short-sighted when they need to think as global citizens. In times of extreme pressure, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, I was disappointed to see even the rich and prosperous countries look inward first, only for their people. Multilateral organizations, including the United Nations, are now weaker than they were before. even in 1990s. As of today, Security Council, their perpetual deadlock has cost its credibility and credibility of the United Nations as a whole. Key regional groups are alarmingly diminished because of their internal divisions. We need more alliances among civil societies, NGOs, international organizations, academics, and philanthropic organizations. These collaborations were so powerful during negotiations on the Paris Climate Change Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. And the 2015 was the highest peak in terms of multilateralism. And I'm very proud that I was one of many leaders working together. Governments must work for peace, human rights, and development at home, but they must also accept their collective responsibilities to other nations. This means every country must reduce its carbon footprint, work together in international forums, and use its influence to de-escalate conflicts. It is essential that we work to overcome hatred of the other and resist the endless quest for economic expansion, religious dominance, and military power. The people of Myanmar need our support as the Tatmadaw military authorities respond to a peaceful protest with the crimes against humanity. More than 850 people have been killed, 4,500 people are detained, including the political leaders like the president and the national councillor. While I also fully appreciate the genuine security concerns of Israeli people, unless two-state solutions are respected by both sides, it will be the Palestinian people who will never be safe from Israel's overpowering military power. Leaders, they must sit down together for a durable and lasting peace. The Afghanistan people, especially women and rights, must be protected from the most extreme Taliban edicts. It's time for the United Nations and member states help create a new peace framework for Afghanistan as Americans and NATO's are now withdrawing from there. Ladies and gentlemen, we have so much work ahead. In fact, that's one of the reasons I finally decided to write this short memoir to encourage world leaders, lawmakers, and anyone who aspires to make the world healthier, more peaceful, and more equitable. And this is my continuing commitment to work with the world leaders and citizens to make much better world for all. In fact, I have established a Ban Ki-moon Center for a Ban Ki-moon Foundation for a better world, a better future, and in Seoul and in Vienna, Austria, where one of the United Nations headquarters is located, I have established Ban Ki-moon Center for global citizens, together with my old good friend, the former president of Austria, Heinz Fischer. This is my opening statement, and I'll be very pleased to have your comments or questions, whatever you may have. Thank you very much.
I have to put in one correction. You made the same mistake as your distinguished predecessor, Boutros Ghali. He used to call me Ian Smith as well. Ian Smith was the racist prime minister of Rhodesia.
So you are Ian Smith then?
I am Ian Williams.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry.
I know you know that.
You
It's just it seems to be happened in the UN.
That's a terrible mistake.
It struck me that you're following in Boutros
You
Ghali's
have always
footsteps.
a sharp yes. I'm sorry.
I am not Ian Smith, and no relation in any way. Pleased to say, apart from the first name.
Please forgive me my mistake.
Yes, absolvo te, as they say in the church.
Okay, that's.
But going back, I mean, it comes upon your when you first arrived, I mean, you're sort of characterized, you're famous for having a low profile almost. You did not rock the boat. You've got a string of achievements, which you mentioned in the book. You know, you supported women's, you set up UN Women, you supported gay and lesbian rights, you did, you know, you strongly spoke out on all sorts of issues. But this isn't the public impression you got. You were not, you weren't beating your chest on the world stage. You were very quiet. And I noticed as I read the memoirs that you've been insulted by some of the best people to be insulted by, whether it's the president of Sudan, whether it's the king of Morocco, whether it's Netanyahu, who you mentioned was one of the least likable people in the world. All of these people you seem to have tangled with, but you kept your cool in public while presumably standing them off in one-on-ones.
But I'm a person of resolute, determined will. Even though I look soft, even though I speak softly, but there was unfortunately some misunderstandings on the part of the others whom I was dealing with, because you know I was soft spoken. But that does not mean that I didn't have my own principles and form. How could I become elected Secretary General of the United Nations from a small, you know, torn countries like Korea? But that means I was very much committed. In fact, even staff of the United Nations were misunderstanding my style, different from Kofi Annan or like Boutros Ghali, etc. I told them my style, my leadership style is like water. People often regard water just powerless, so you know, tasteless, and doesn't have any color. But water, I think among 5 elements in our world, water is the most powerful and strongest force. But normally water does not use its force unless it is absolutely necessary. People often think that the fire or metal, that's the hardest and strongest, but water can extinguish a fire, and the steel can rust if it is put in the water. And water does not always confront any obstacles in its way. It just avoids and goes around the rocks. But when it is absolutely necessary, it can, you know, roll big rocks when there is a tsunami. This is what I learned from Oriental philosophy. There is a Chinese philosopher called Lao Tzu, who lived in the 26th centuries, 2,600 years ago, even earlier than you know, Gongzi, you know, Confucius. Then he said, the highest virtue of our life is to act like water. This is what I have written calligraphy and presented it to President Obama on his birthday, one of his birthday. I told him, look, Mr. President, try to, your leadership should like doing water. He immediately understood, you know, I explained everything. So this, I'm very proud that, you know, my style has been later not fully, but quite significantly appreciated by the world's people.
Looking at particular incidents, we've got a lot of questions coming up because it's a very particular UN role in Western Sahara. As you know, Donald Trump made a unilateral presidential proclamation recognizing Morocco's sovereignty. And it's been, what, 50 years since, no, 30. I was actually at the press conference where it was announced that the referendum would be held within a year. Because the Swiss Joseph Mance, I think it was, who was the then representative, said they had the election list. There was no obstacle. And my question to him then was, have you told the King of Morocco? And the question is, have you told the King of Morocco that this is occupied territory and there's UN resolution?
This is something which I still feel regrettable that I have not been able to do much more than I tried and I expected. In fact, His Majesty King of Morocco and I may have been maintaining a very good relationship at the beginning, but now we are mutually respecting relationship. But he seemed to have some misunderstanding on my position. I really tried to visit and see for myself the real situation and conditions in Western Sahara. But Moroccan government has never agreed to my visit. But it's not official denial. And they always said that the king's schedule is not convenient, and he has to receive the Secretary General himself on the spot. Then I've been waiting 1 year, second year, third year, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, something like this. And I counted that when was the last time my predecessor had visited. Kofi Annan visited at the early beginning of his time. That became almost 20 years, not exactly 20 years, but 18, 19 years in total, without any Secretary General. Myself having visited Morocco, I mean Western Sahara. I visited Morocco several times officially, but not the Western Sahara where United Nations mission was there. And I really wanted to meet the people and also meet the people in the refugee camp. Then I got some understanding. Look, you seem to be very much busy all the time. Then let's do like this way. I will first go on my own and visit Morocco and brief and discuss on this matter with His Majesty. And they agreed. They agreed. When I visited and wanted to visit the refugee camp, people were surrounding me, thousands of people were surrounding me. So my car and convoy were just stopped. And a lot of people were demonstrating against us, just touching and, kicking my cars, and with all placards with very terrible scenes, people bleeding, etc., etc. It was a very dangerous moment. So I had to give up visiting the refugee camps. Then I had the press interview on my own when I visited Algeria later. Then I used the word occupation. I was very much in a very sensitive mood. I was not happy at the time. So I spoke out that how do you expect that those people who were born 40 years ago in the refugee camp, what would be the end of the world? To their eyes, the end of the world would be boundary of the refugee. That's sad, under occupation. Then King and the Moroccan government were very much unhappy about the word, using the word occupation. Then foreign minister came to the United Nations, asked me to apologize. But by that time, my spokesman had already explained all the situations and regretted and tried to make the things corrected. But they wanted to formal apology, etc., etc. Because of that, I was not able to finally resolve this personal misunderstanding between His Majesty and myself. But in 2016, I visited Morocco, and I had a bilateral relations with His Majesty King. And our meeting was cordial. Our meeting was cordial. And I met him in 2017 after my retirement in Paris during President Macron's lunch in Élysée Palace. And we shook hands and we smiled and we exchanged the greetings. That's my relationship. And
you didn't mention the word occupation on these occasions.
Of course, it was not necessary to repeat all these things again. I hope there should be no misunderstandings on the part of Moroccan people and government. But what I was also very much unhappy, disappointed was that somehow many thousands of, tens of thousands of Moroccan people came out to the street and demonstrated against me, ripping off my pictures, etc. This must have been reported in the media. So that was not something they should do. It was not good friendship again, for the Secretary General of the United Nations. But I hope one day I'll be able to visit Morocco and meet His Majesty King and also restore such a very cordial, happy relationship. But I also sympathize with the people in Western Sahara, while United Nations is really doing utmost efforts to help their life conditions, but it's not easy.
We don't want to keep on that, but it's an issue that keeps coming up. There you are, you're the Secretary General of the United Nations. United Nations has been involved for over 50 years in trying to implement its own resolutions. The Security Council says that Morocco must leave. Morocco and the Security Council agreed there should be a referendum. And the referendum is almost an honorary Secretary General. It's never now. It's always tomorrow. It's always some special conditions that the king has. Or, you have to let me pick the voters. You have to let me vote for the voters. But
let our own referendum, a brief visit by our Secretary General was very difficult. It was not my fully successful visit. I was not able to see all. I just came back. Yeah.
Well, taking a step backwards, I mean, there are reasons why this has failed. I mean, the US initially and then France afterwards, and Morocco, people are not prepared to stand up to Morocco and say, no, it is an occupation. Now, shut up and finish it.
The Security Council and UN, except in the early stage, many 50 years ago or so, then there was a briefly mentioned occupation in General Assembly resolution. After that, somehow, I don't know what was the reason, but the word occupation has not been used by the Security Council and General Assembly. That's true. But I found the word at the earliest beginning of the situation. The General Assembly mentioned the occupation, but not after that.
Well, they did the same with East Timor, and East Timor, it all worked out in the end. Everyone accepted it was an occupation, and they finished the occupation.
They got independence, East Timor, yes.
Yes, on the basis, same resolutions, almost the same year in many ways. But moving on from there, there are other people rude to. I mean, it's not just Morocco, but for example, there are continual complaints that everybody, I hate to use the word, but it's kowtows to China. That China pushes language and insists that its interpretation of resolutions are standard. And so, you're from the region. You must have had a great deal of difficulty in standing up to them because they are very obdurate.
As Korean and neighboring countries, Korea and China have been maintaining a very good relationship, friendly relationship. And China is the largest trading partner as for Korea. But one of the significant changes in the international geopolitical arena during the last 30 years is the rise of China. China's share in global trade was merely 3% in 1995. By 2018, China has taken 12%, so significant rise. And they have been providing $60 billion for African Union for 3 years. So their relationship is very deepening through Belt and Road, etc. Belt and Road Initiative has also raised China's political profile significantly. This might have given, to my mind, the Chinese government a sort of a sense and pride and confidence in their role in the international arena. Now having risen as a G2 next to G1 United States. Now it is quite sad to see rivalry between US and China, but to my mind, this rivalry confrontational relationship may be summarized in 3 C's, like confrontation or competition or cooperation. Confrontation in the field of values and principles such as democratic governance, human rights, and geopolitical issues such as the South China Sea or Taiwan Strait issues. Competition in the area of global trade or some conflicts like in competition, technology and sciences, or even now they are competing in space, in space technologies. And again, there is an issue of intellectual property rights. I heard in person directly from President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Li Keqiang stating publicly that China will protect and respect intellectual property rights during Boao Forum, where I'm sitting as chairman of the Boao Forum. This Boao Forum is, they want to make like a Davos Forum of Asia. It's a huge forum. Then cooperation now. I'd like to emphasize the cooperation in addressing global challenges, such as climate change, COVID-19 pandemic, and other sustainable development goals issues. I think this is no time for any such heightened tension between such a big powers like the United States, China, and European Union. I am urging that they should fully cooperate. I fully understand the concerns shared among the United States and European Union. Priority should be given on how to promote mutual cooperation in addressing the climate crisis and COVID-19 and other, poverty eradication issues, etc. Now, when I remember now when we were working to strike a deal on climate change agreement, it was just because of a full cooperation between President Obama and President Xi Jinping working together. Without the China's full participation and cooperation, even now, we might not have been able to have a Paris climate change agreement. This is my personal advice at this time as a former Secretary General. I believe in the course of working together among the US, China, European Union, I think we may expect a more forward-looking position on the issues relating to fundamental values of human rights and democratic rules. That's my hope.
Well, one of the phenomena, because of the composition of the Security Council as permanent members, is the problems when members like France even, and the US and China introduce a veto for sort of extraneous reasons. They're trying to prove a point and to show that they have power. So there are UN initiatives which are blocked because of the threat or the promise of a Chinese or a Russian veto. Do you see any way to get around this problem?
This is really, I think, very difficult and challenging issues. And when the P5s, those most powerful countries sitting in the Security Council, not cooperate closely and fully, nothing can be done. This is the charter provision of the United Nations that they can veto whatever they don't like. So this is something which member states have been urging during last at least 3 decades, maybe since the beginning of this system, but most recently, 2000, year 2000, there was serious attempt to address this. The General Assembly established the task force, and then beyond task force, the General Assembly itself has taken this issue as their agenda. But nothing has happened until now because no veto power wielding countries wanted to change and reform this Security Council. In fact, diplomatically, rhetorically, the United States and the United Kingdom, France, they were supporting such and such countries like India, Japan, Brazil, and Germany. But in the end, nobody was wholeheartedly supporting this one. Then there was some straight and strong and very, I think, advisable campaign from the French government. They proposed that in the case of totally humanitarian affairs, like a situation in Syria, etc., then let us voluntarily refrain from using a veto power. But that has not been entertained and accepted by other members of the Security Council, particularly Americans, Russians, and Chinese. I think they didn't like it, but I was, as a Secretary General, I fully supported and advised them to consider refraining from exercising veto power when it is absolutely purely humanitarian issues. Now look at the case that Russia has been vetoing all the draft resolution concerning Syria. That's why Syrian people are now suffering for exactly 10 years now, since 2011. 6.6 million Syrian people had to flee their country, have become refugees in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq, and some in Egypt. So I have visited all these refugee camps, and more than 5.5 million people living inside the Syria. They are living under very dire condition, without water, without food. And now Syrian people, strangely, elected Bashar Assad as their president with 95% of support.
Yes.
Many media called it as a sham election, but this is what now we are experiencing. In such a case, it is only the people, helpless people, who do not have anything to do with all these political issues, they are suffering. So it is not fair. It's not, the United Nations should have done much more. My regret as Secretary General at the time was that I was not able to see the end of this Arab Spring. But I have done a lot to help Syrian people in close coordination and support with the Emir of Kuwait. I have convened 4 donor conferences, 3 times in Kuwait and 1 time in London, working together, United Nations, Prime Minister David Cameron, and also Emir of Kuwait. And we mobilized $1 billion of, much more than $1 billion for Syrian people, for refugees. So we need to have this kind of a compassionate leadership when we are not fully able to have a political resolution. But I'm urging again, world leaders to be united to resolve all these conflict issues.
Looking at this from the way you've presented it there, do you think it was a failure of Western and American diplomacy that they couldn't persuade or cajole or push the Russians into withdrawing their veto and cooperating in Syria? Assure them that their interests would be maintained, that they keep the naval base, but they must stop supporting chemical weapons and so on?
This is something which I regret very much. Then the global powers like the United States and the United Kingdom, France, Russia, China, and European Union as a group, they should have a much broader global vision based on global citizenship. But they are all looking into their own country's national interest. That is why just the people without committing any wrong, they are suffering. But even in Syria and in dictatorial countries, the rulers, they don't have any difficulties in their living, and they're really living in a luxurious way while people are dying and starving. That's not moral, and they should have some really moral obligations if there is still some problems in political issues. That's what I've been really trying to do my utmost effort, at least to mobilize humanitarian assistance. But that was not enough. Then there must be a political will converging for humanity and global peace. And I'm urging again them.
One of the powers of the Secretary General, I think it was Kofi Annan who pointed it out in a very gentle way, because he was quiet and unassuming like you, but he put the power of naming and shaming, the power of pointing an international finger at countries that stepped outside the law and saying, you're doing this, we're accusing you of doing it, stop doing it, or we'll hold you up to international shame. But it's something that the UN system is very reluctant to do, isn't it?
But as the Secretary General, I have been quite straightforward. In the face of the leader concerned and also publicly, I've been really condemning in the strongest possible terms when it was relating to genuine human rights issues as well as some basic principles of the United Nations Charter. Then I had been, confronted by the leaders concerned. Even I made my strong voice in Russia while attending Sochi Olympic Games in 2014. I criticized Russia and President Putin because he was not allowing at the beginning of the Olympic campaign those people with the different sexual orientations, and that was wholeheartedly, criticized by international community. And I spoke on the soil of Sochi just one day before. Then I really criticized. Then the Russians seems to have been very much unhappy. Then, as you may remember, as you may know, the Ambassador Turkin, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, he came and he conveyed the strongest possible, complaints against me. So we had some very delicate relationship with him. Of course, later we became very good friends. But I've been really speaking out. President Mugabe, I spoke out very clearly, publicly, and I've been speaking out through my spokesperson's statement or my own direct statement.
This is very impressive because there isn't a huge political constituency. This is almost the third rail, as they say, grabbing hold of the live rail on the railways. It's an issue which you're obviously got a lot of principled support for, but everybody else kept quiet almost, unless they had big domestic constituencies like the US or the UK behind it.
I've been really trying to exercise my authority as a Secretary General. I think I have been vocal when it was absolutely necessary. But at the same time, as I said at the beginning of my, statement, I've been really trying to as courteous to the leaders, even to those people known as a dictatorial leadership. At the beginning, I was really trying to respect their leadership, but in quiet way, when we were sitting between us, then I've been really speaking very hard, spoke out that you must change for the benefit of your people, for the sake of your leadership, and etc., etc. This has been my leadership, but I have been really conveying my message clearly to all the leaders.
But this aspect doesn't always come out in public, and you're because you're fairly self-effacing about this. What is the? Do you think that there's a lesson here? In retrospect, should you have challenged them publicly on some of these aspects?
Well, Secretary General is some different from national leaders. We have to deal with the 193 member states. Sometimes I wonder about the wisdom of some leaders who are really speaking out directly, publicly, when you have such kind of political power or military power as a global power. Sometimes they can do it, but as a Secretary General, sometimes you need to be very sensitive sometimes, and you have to deal with so many leaders. You can just shut at the leader once, then do not meet, then the opportunity will just disappear, will be lost for Secretary General to deal with this matter with the leader concerned. Therefore, I've been trying to be as courteous as possible. But when it was absolutely necessary, I have spoken out. This is what I have been doing to Zimbabwe, and also again the Western Sahara issues and many other issues. I cannot recall, but the record speaks. If you read my statement and media report, yeah.
Well, one, you don't mention it in the book, but I remember I wrote about it at the time. You have the almost unique success of getting Israel to pay for damage to UN facilities in Gaza. How did you do that? It wasn't publicized, which I presume was part of the package, but you actually got them to hand over a check to rebuild a UN facility that they've blown up.
I have maintained a good relationship personally with succeeding leadership of Israel, Netanyahu and Olmert, President Peres, etc. Then I've been sitting with them and really trying to convince in a very sincere manner, respecting their genuine security concerns. And I think I may be the first Secretary General who has spoken out that supporting Israel's concern. While visiting Israel, I have publicly stated that I fully appreciate the genuine security concern of Israel. At the same time, I have spoken to the right, in front of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Then you have to have a wisdom. There are, people have a freedom of choice. You have choice in selecting whom to acquaint, like a friendship, or even you may have a choice with your spouses. If you don't like a spouse, then you can divorce. But you will never do that way when you are neighboring countries each other. Particularly geographical neighbors. You don't have any choice, freedom of choice when it comes to neighbors. You have to have the wisdom to live side by side in peace and security. This is, in fact, the basic principles and the guideline of Security Council resolution, many Security Council resolutions. Now, I am very much concerned by the recent, again, airstrike by new Prime Minister Bennett. Of course, it was a countering against this bomb balloon, sent by Hamas. While two-state solution remains the best way to ensure the rights, security, and prosperity for both Israel and Palestine, I'm afraid to say that this realization seems to be getting more and more remote. But that should not be the way. They should be able to come closer and closer. During last at least 5-6 decades, I think they have been discussing, negotiating with the help of the United States and European Union, and the quartet, I was a member of quartet. Then there are all the ideas, and the solution packages are on the table. It's a matter of choice of which, and some mix of all these choices is on the table. But they were all, staying away from this. Now, stability, accountability again for violation of international law by Israeli and Palestinians is necessary to break this cycle of impunity. Recent lessons must be learned on the importance of Palestinian democracy and reconciliation for a future and sustainable peace. I think regional security depends on a solution to the Palestinian questions. And there are many elements. In that regard, of course, we expect that United States and European Union can play a much important role in helping Palestinians and Israelis living side by side together. The last month, the deadly 11-day war between Israel and Hamas was one of the most serious conflicts in recent years. That reminds me, if I may be allowed to say a few more minutes, that reminds me of my active engagement with the leadership in the region. In 2009, when the conflict happened, it happened in almost the end of 2008, and Hamas and Israelis seemed to be aware that President Bush was leaving in just 20 days away. Then there was a huge crisis. Even United Nations warehouse was bombed by Israeli attack, and the international school was also bombed by Israeli. For those two things, Israeli Defense Minister Ehud Barak publicly apologized to me that it was their mistake and apologized to me. Then I had a very serious negotiation with regional leaders, particularly Ehud Olmert, Prime Minister. I strongly pushed him that stop fighting, declare unilateral ceasefire. There is no way that the mutually agreed upon ceasefire will happen. In fact, the President Sarkozy and European leaders were really trying to do that, but to fail. Then I really pushed him very hard, and he indeed declared unilateral ceasefire. His concern was that I'm willing to do that, but Hamas does not respond. We are the one who will be attacked. Then I told him that I'll make sure that Hamas will respond. Of course, I didn't have any contact with Hamas, and I flew immediately to Syria. I met the President Assad. Look, to make sure that as soon as President, Prime Minister almost announces, Hamas must respond positively. Then I flew immediately to Sharm el-Sheikh, meeting President Mubarak, and there were a lot of leaders from France, Spain, and Italy, and European Union, Jordan, Kuwait, and etc. In the middle of our meeting, Hamas declared agreement, responding to February to the ceasefire. So that's the way I was able to stop this fighting. That I termed it as a sort of, in my memoir, conveyor belt diplomacy. Once you are sitting on this conveyor, you have to move around the region, 4 countries in a day. Can you visit 4 countries, meeting 4 leaders in a day? That was very hectic. And then when second time happened, then I traveled together with John Kerry, then Secretary of State. And before that, Hillary Clinton. We were, even though we were not flying in the same airplane, but we were, visiting just, together at the same time, but with some time sequence. So that's the way we were able to really address, quickest way possible to stop this fighting. I really hope that no such necessity of a conveyor belt will happen. They have already, destroyed much during 11-day war. Now, just the beginning, 3 days after the leadership of Bennett, he was engaging already in an airstrike. So I hope, even though it was provoked mostly by Hamas, they have to really sit down. President Abbas and Prime Minister Bennett must sit down together and choose all this among the options available. Then they will be able to get full support from the countries concerned, including thwarted.
We have a question from Dulcie Lineback from Pass Blue, which I think rolls into another one if it's not too much of a stretch. This is confession time. She says, what mistakes did you make that stick out the most? And I was going to suggest from your distress in the book, the issue of the cholera in Haiti and the UN's refusal to acknowledge it. Was this the legal bureaucracy outmaneuver you? Because I feel from your behavior that you would have acknowledged it and carried on if the lawyers hadn't have sat on your shoulders and said, no, you can't.
It's nothing to do with the legal bureaucracy. It has nothing to do with the bureaucracy. It is just international law applying to all the nations, all the international organizations, all the diplomatic officers. The United Nations in its entity itself is, I think, genuinely the largest and biggest international organization. That's why the US court, when there was some legal suit filed, the State Department said, we don't have jurisdiction.
No, that's true about the legal point, but it did seem at the time that the UN was not acknowledging the actual causation. You had Nepalese peacekeepers who came in and shortly afterwards were leaking sewers, and shortly afterwards a brand of cholera trackable to them. And the UN was busily denying the causation, not legal responsibility, but causation even, it seemed.
I did not deny. And I apologized in the General Assembly, and I apologize our moral, and I even said this is staying in our relationship between United Nations and Haitian people and government, but it was not intended. But as you may remember, when I organized an expert group, fact-finding expert group composed of United States and Brazil, Peru, and India, the first finding was that it was because of confluence of circumstances. that was challenged by WHO. WHO, they said that they found some evidence that this has come from peacekeepers, barracks. Then I constituted second group with different countries and different scientists, and it's not clear, but they have found out that these pipelines where Nepalese peacekeepers were staying were broken and damaged, and all this through these pipelines, all this human waste has been flown into Albonite River. So that was the one. Then I apologized to the General Assembly in 3 languages, like French, English, and Haitian local language.
Yes.
Yeah. Then I really tried to mobilize as much as support, development support, and immediate humanitarian support. I was deeply touched and moved by such a spontaneous support from international community when I convened the donor conference with President Clinton, my special envoy at the time on Haiti, and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, with 3 of us sitting and inviting world leaders. And in one day, we got $9.9 billion. That's a huge, largest sum ever. Then at the end of my term, the last month of my term, December 1st, 2016, I reported. Finally, I was not able to finish my job, but I had to leave, and I apologized again and proposed $400 million for development project. But unfortunately, this proposal was utterly unfunded by the member state. I don't know why member state were not willing to support. Then this is what I can tell you. I do not avoid my responsibility as the United Nations, but legal thing is legal. United Nations is not liable according to international law. That's not what I am insisting and emphasizing, but I am more insisting on moral responsibility, which we should have done more.
We're coming to the end now. I've just got one throw-in question. Do you have any plans to meet Kim Jong-un, Panam John, in the near future?
Well, that is one of my regrettable things. There were 3 opportunities when I was invited by North Korean leaders. During the time of Kim Jong-il, his father. The first invitation came to me, I was happy, but I was a little bit cautious because just 1 month or so before Copenhagen COP15 meeting on climate, it was so important. We were really campaigning for seal the deal in Copenhagen, even though we were not successful. So I quietly, apologized. Why don't you give me another date after Copenhagen? Then the date came in January 2010. Before that, for that date, I consulted with the South Korean President Lee Myung-bak and the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. They all wholeheartedly supported. But somehow at the last minute, they canceled. Then we realized that there was some foreign troops or foreign guests coming into North Korea. When such a thing happened, they always shut down their borders. So that was one thing. Second one happened during my time to Seoul, and there was already a previous agreement. I was invited to visit not Pyongyang, but Kaesong Industrial Complex. And I expected that I would be able to meet the North Korean leader in Kaesong when I go there. Then there was a press conference in Seoul, and many foreign reporters was asking me whether you are going to raise a human rights issue in North Korea when you go there. Of course, I said, I will raise this. As soon as this was reported, then it was canceled.
Yes.
Third time, again, there was a firm invitation. It was 2015. Then I consulted with President Obama. He wholeheartedly supported Korean president, Chinese president, Russian president. They all supported me. I was very much, encouraged. Then somehow, without knowing, real reason, I think this visit was leaked by some media, some South Korean media. Then it was canceled.
You can't
The
trust
whole
them.
South Korean media was reporting that I should raise this and that, including human rights issue, etc. Then they just canceled. So this is quite regrettable. But now, as a private citizen, the possibility is more remote now. Korean president had already met the North Korean leader 3 times, 2 times officially, and 1 time more, informal way. Then the U.S. president visited, met the North Korean leader twice, and he became the first U.S. president to put his soil on the North Korean soil. So there was a hugely encouraging circumstances happen. But end result is the same thing. North Korea just keeping themselves, completely blocking themselves. This is very sad. Now, President Biden, I hope he will be able to really make some much more different way. The
Climb
style
that
seems
wall,
to be
Mr. President.
now President Trump's style is a sort of a reality show type, like a top down, and many people were excited by the way he was conducting his diplomacy, but it's more than that. This is a dead serious issue. This is a life and death and very serious security concerns on the Korean Peninsula, and which has broader regional implications in terms of security and peace. Therefore, I think President Biden's position is right to have a sort of a bottom-up approach, have a solid agreement step by step, and make sure that North Korea implements all. In that regard, I'm very much encouraged by the joint statement of G7. In the common statement, they call for complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and demanded North Korea complete, verifiable, and irreversible abandonment of North Korea's unlawful weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missile program in accordance with relevant Security Council resolution. And they also reaffirmed that continuing sanctions resolution of the United Nations Security Council. I know that Republic of Korea is ready, US is ready, so it's now in the hands of North Korea. But they are now completely isolated. The economic situation seems to be very seriously difficult. Now, I was surprised when the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un announced an appeal to these people that let's have an arduous march, which they did once in 1990s during his grandfather's time. Arduous march. Do you know what had happened? North Korean economy was just collapsed, and more than 3 million people have starved to death. Now the situation seems to be very difficult at this time. So it is time for North Korea to open up, and as a responsible member of the international community. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're coming to the end now. It's 6 o'clock It's after 6. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. I did read your book from cover to cover, as you know, and I will, Jamie, if you can start rolling it. Tomorrow we have another press briefing about the South China Sea and whether China will attack Taiwan, which is something we haven't mentioned today for various reasons, and we have many more coming. But thank you very much, Secretary General. It's been very good.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, President Ian Williams.
That's the one, yes.
Of the Foreign Press Association and the distinct members of the FPA for your very kind attention on my memoir and my legacy as Secretary General. And I hope that we all work together. This is our moral responsibility now for world peace and the prosperity. Thank you very much.
I wish you a happy retirement on the royalties because you will sell so many books. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.